Our primary mission here at Alternate Media is to bridge the gap between Judaism and Christianity, as it's existed for far too long. Yeshua, as we know, never intended to start a new religion. He was a religious Jew.
I think that's a certain point in every believer's life where we think, isn't there more?
There has definitely been a need within the church. That's something that a lot of Christians are searching for. A lot of Christians know that there is something missing in their faith. What indeed is intended to fill that is Judaic roots of the faith.
The New Testament is very clear about bridging the gap between Jew and Gentile, and we're just returning that mission back to the modern day. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another altered podcast, preparing the way, whatever we're calling it these days. We keep changing our minds on that one, but anyway, we are doing this as a continuation as a part of our Trinity series. We've got a few of those videos up already on the channel. If you haven't seen many of those, you should definitely check those out. It'll kind of give you a baseline of where we're coming from, and this is part 2 of reviewing the debate between Dr. Dale Tuggy and Dr. James White, two very prominent figures in the realm of Trinitarian theology. James White is a renowned Greek scholar, Trinitarian. Dr. Dale Tuggy is a Unitarian and also an up-and-coming renowned scholar. He's gaining more popularity, at least in my book. And so today we're going to go over their rebuttals. In part 1, we've already done their opening statements. And so today, part 2, the rebuttals. So before we get fully started into reviewing this debate, I shall bring up my colleague and switch our orders there. Brad, how are you tonight? Good. And you've seen this debate all the way through already before. Is that right? Actually, I don't hear you. Something's up. No. I don't think it's your fault. I think it's my fault. Because your mic is on, you're not muted on my side, but I'm not hearing you when you talk. Wow, nothing. Interesting. How about everyone in the chat? Can you guys hear Brad? Okay, interesting. I got nothing. So that's very weird. You can hear me though, right? Okay, so when you do speak, it's all of your audio compressed and you sound like a mouse, and so it plays in the span of half a second. It's very weird. I don't think it's I think it might be a technical difficulty on the host side of this thing. That's very weird. Yeah, if anyone's in the chat, please can you let me know if you can hear Brad or not, because I'm not getting him to come through. Maybe I'm going to remove you, sign out, and sign back in and see if that does anything. Okay. No, reset your browser. Yeah. So, all right. So anyway, while we're waiting for him to do that, I guess I will introduce you to what I'm having to drink tonight. I didn't bring the bottle with me, but I'm having the Bushmills Prohibition era formula, which is a throwback to the 1920s original formula with the Prohibition. Really nice, by order of the Peaky Blinders. So it's a Peaky Blinder special. And my colleague Brad seems to be back on stage. All right.
All good?
All good now. There you go. All right. That's what we needed. Perfect. Wow. That was very interesting.
It's been a while since we've had something like that.
Yeah, that's incredibly unheard of, but okay. Hey, sometimes it happens.
All right. Who's with you in spirit?
Okay, I just introduced everyone. I'm having the Prohibition era Bushmills.
Oh, nice. The Shelby Company Limited.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, I love that one. That's a good one. It's very. I have a bottle of that I've not opened because I'm saving it because it's a limited edition.
I have an unopened bottle above my head here on my bookshelf, and I have 2 other bottles.
Yeah,
that I actually
yeah.
drink.
Hopefully, like 30 years from now, that bottle will be worth something.
Yeah, hopefully.
I'm finishing off the last bit. I actually just finished pouring it of the Rebel 100.
Nice.
Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. It's, I mean, for a cheap bourbon, highly recommend.
Fair enough. Okay, so I already kind of gave people a little bit of a breakdown what we're getting into. So because of the technical difficulties, I say we just jump right into it. All right, so let's go ahead and add here. And again, feel free to jump in and speak. If you have something to say, I can pause it real quick. Cool. I might do that. But for the most part, we're going to try and watch it through, take notes, and then we'll review when Dr. James White is finished.
It is very difficult to do a rebuttal when none of your presentation was addressed. None of the key texts that specifically identified Jesus as Yahweh were addressed, refuted, dealt with, even mentioned. I'd like to point out Dr. Tuggy had my book. There's an entire chapter. Every text that I presented is in the book. So now he's only got 10 minutes in his rebuttal to actually engage exegetically with these texts, unless we just heard how that's going to be dealt with. And that is, well, there are difficult texts to understand. You know, maybe you just go with the majority view.
I am going to stop him right here. The rebuttal is not
the point of an opening statement.
Yeah,
my goodness.
He just gave his opening statement. That was not a rebuttal.
Yeah. The rebuttal period right here, right? Is it like the point here for you, James White, is that you get a chance to immediately give a rebuttal to Dale Tuggy's opening statement.
And meanwhile,
this is your rebuttal.
Meanwhile, Dale Tuggy will return with rebuttals to your opening statement.
That's the way this goes.
He just gave his opening statement. His opening statement was an opening statement. It was not. He could not. You don't make an opening statement after your opponent gives one and then write it on the spot as a rebuttal. You don't do that. So yeah, that's just first and foremost, that's poor debate etiquette on his part to bring that up. And unfortunately, there are not enough people who understand that's kind of how this goes. So that's going to be bought in by a lot of people. But that is a massive blunder for James White.
It's a posturing technique, right? Most everybody who is watching this, most everybody in the congregation watching this doesn't know proper debate technique, right? So they are going to follow suit with exactly what James White wants them to think, which is that, Dale Tuggy didn't address anything that James White said in his opening statement. Well, yeah, he wasn't supposed to. That's not the point.
Yeah, he will during his rebuttal. And then, just so you know, Dr. James White, so you don't get confused, his rebuttal is not a cross-examination. So when you begin your cross-examination, don't accuse him of not being cross-examining to his rebuttal that he gave for his opening statement. Yeah, anyway, moving forward.
No, we need to know why the apostles specifically and purposefully identify Jesus as Yahweh in the highest possible words.
Hold on.
Now he's only got 10 minutes to do it in instead of the 25 that he had.
I'm sorry, I just can't let that one fly. He used very direct wording. He said the apostles specifically refer to him as, and then he pronounces the divine name there. He can't give a single example of where that is the case.
Because it's not the case.
It literally never happens at any point in the New Testament. So, like, at this point, he's just lying.
Yeah, he's making a claim, a very erroneous claim, without
evidence. Making a claim that he can't substantiate. There's no single verse in the New Testament that says that.
And on top of that, he is accusing his competitor of not addressing what isn't there, but he's saying these things are there and you're not addressing them, but they're not there. And in fact, if I look back at my notes too, Dr. Tuggy is very particularly good in his opening statement. One of the first things he says in the beginning of his opening statement is the phrase Jesus is, and then any way, shape, or form God or Yod He Vav He is not in any creed. Even not only is it not in the Bible, it's not even in any of the creeds. So it's not traditionally Trinitarian in any Orthodox standard already. So Dr. White's little bit here, well, Dr. Tuggy did address that, actually. He's already brought it up. It's not even in the creed. So your accusation is falling a little flat here.
Yeah. We didn't let him get far. Let's try and get through the whole thing.
Yeah, if we can. Here we go.
Now, I want to mention to you, and I think it's very important. It was just said, well, those early centuries, there was no God-man idea. Let me give you two examples that absolutely decimate that falsehood, because it is a falsehood. Ignatius of Antioch, writing to the Ephesians around 108 AD, said the following: there is one physician of flesh and of spirit, generate and ingenerate, God in man, true life in death, both from Mary and from God, first passible and then impassible, Jesus Christ our Lord. That's as close as you're going to get to saying the God-man that I can imagine. And it's in the first generation after the apostles. Those are the words of Ignatius of Antioch. Melito of Sardis, preaching about 70 years after Ignatius's death, used these terms: he who hung the earth in place is hanged. He who fixed the heavens in place is fixed in place. He who made all things fast is made fast on a tree. The sovereign is insulted. God is murdered. The king of Israel is destroyed by an Israelite hand. This is the one who made the heavens and the earth and formed mankind in the beginning. The one proclaimed by the law and the prophets, the one enfleshed in a virgin, the one hanged on a tree, the one buried in the earth. Melito likewise goes on to use such phrases as the man God, or the God-man, section 52, and by nature being God and man in section 58. That's as close as you're going to get to that language. And this is long before there was anything that could be called Roman Catholicism. There was no such thing at this point in history. So I'm not giving you Catholic traditions. I gave you exegesis, and we got nothing but arguments about, well, we just can't believe in the incarnation. The word can't become flesh. God can't take on a human nature. That would go against our philosophical arguments. And I said in my opening, what this debate is going to be about is, will you listen to what Scripture says, or will you take an external philosophical set of questions and filter out what the text of Scripture says on these vital issues? Let me give you a clear example. The time goes very, very fast, but there's an excellent example that came up in his presentation. He said, compare the praise of God upon his throne in Revelation chapter 4 with the Lamb in Revelation chapter 5. Turn with me to Revelation chapters 4 and 5. Look in your Bible. I want you to look at these things because I was astonished when I saw this. Think about what we have. Revelation chapter 4 does show God the Father upon his throne, and it's specifically meant to parallel what we saw in Isaiah chapter 6. But remember something, John tells us that the one who is seen in Isaiah chapter 6 is Jesus, sitting upon the throne as Yahweh, being worshiped by angels. There is no higher form of worship than that, my friends. That is not some secondary thing. But now in Revelation 4 and 5, now we've had the incarnation. Now we've had the ministry of Jesus. And so in chapter 4, this looks like Isaiah chapter 6, but then something happens. We have the scroll, no one's found worthy. John is weeping, and to stop weeping, the lion of the lamb, the lion of the tribe of Judah, who is a lamb. It's meant to be something to make us go, what is happening here? He has overcome, and John looks and he sees this lamb standing as if slain. So here's the resurrected Jesus. He has accomplished his salvific work, and he is now there standing before the throne. Verse 8, and when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each one having a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain and purchased for God with your blood people from every tribe and tongue and nation, and you made them to be a king and priest to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. He has accomplished his salvific work. Then I looked and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne and living creatures and the elders. These are the highest creatures God has made. Okay? And the number of them was myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing, the exact same things that were ascribed to God in chapter 4. And now they're being assigned to the Lamb standing as if slain. Look at verse 13. And every created thing which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and on the sea and all things in them, I heard saying, to him who sits on the throne, and what's the next phrase? And to the Lamb. Every created thing which is in heaven and on earth. What does that tell you? The Lamb is not a created thing. He's the object of the worship of all created things. Oh, but he's distinguished from the Father. Yes, he is. That's what the Trinity is all about. It was the Son that became flesh, not the Father. So you have it right there. To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be the blessing and the honor and the glory and the might forever and ever. And I ask any Unitarian, do you worship Jesus the way he will be worshiped in heaven itself? As a mere man? As a mere creature because God tells you to? Or does this tell us that every created thing, Jesus is excluded from that category? Because he is the maker of all things. That's the whole point of Colossians 1. For by him were all things made, whether in heaven or on earth, visible, invisible, principalities, powers, dominions, authorities, all things created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things suneste can. They hold together. That's the Jesus of the New Testament. He is the creator of all things. And notice the end of chapter 5, and the 4 living creatures who are right there before the throne kept saying, Amen. And the elders fell down, and what do? They worship. They worship. That is the Jesus of the New Testament. And raising all sorts of questions that basically say, we just refuse to believe that God has the power to glorify himself by taking on a human nature and dying in the place of his people. We just won't believe that. You know who else doesn't believe that? All the Muslims in the world. And so if you'd like to hear over and over again the exact same arguments being presented by Muslims around the world, go look at my YouTube page and listen to the debates I've done with them all around the world. It's the exact same argument. They just simply don't believe that God can do what the scriptures say he did. And so we need to hear in the next 10 minutes about Philippians 2, about John 12, about 1 Peter 3:15. We need to hear exegetical refutation. It can't be possible. Not because I don't like what that means. It can't be possible because the exegesis of the text contradicts it. That's what we need in the next 10 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
Oh boy. Okay.
Yeah.
I got a lot of notes.
Yeah, me too. Well, a funny thing that I want to bring up. So it's him and Michael Brown are both very bold, very bold. They both are people who will tell you, yeah, go look at these other debates that I've done where they actually have done terrible. There is a particular debate that he had on his own podcast with a Muslim intellectual, a Muslim intellectual who is quite intellectual, very well read, very well versed. About the subject of the debate was, is the Trinity logical? And he mopped the floor with James White on his own podcast. James White ultimately defaulted to the typical, well, it's a mystery, and since you don't have the Holy Spirit, you can't understand it.
Yeah.
Right? Well, okay, so then you conceded that it's not logical.
Yeah. Lost debate there. So I haven't even seen that one, but I can already tell you that any intellectually honest Trinitarian would tell you, no, it's not logical. That's a losing side. That's part of one of the positions of Trinitarianism is it really can't be understood by any human logic is sort of their position on that. And anyone who tries to tell you otherwise hasn't studied it enough, because any official Trinitarian will tell you it can't be done, which should raise an eyebrow for everybody, by the way. God, at no point does God tell you to ditch your intellectual faculties for any reason. Oftentimes he will ask you of something that would be miraculous, right? But then the miracle happens and the proof is in the pudding, but never in such a way that you just have to just trust me on this one. Don't think about it too hard. And there's never going to be a way to prove it. So don't even worry about it. Unlike, like with Abraham and Sarah, having a child at 99, impossible, but it happened. So the proof is in the pudding. So there's a part in which you are able to accept it because the thing happened. And that's different entirely from a philosophical concept that would be as complicated as the Trinity. But so a couple of notes here. The first thing I noted was the God-man thing that he brought up in the beginning. What? You look like you got something.
But yeah, before we get to that, because he is responding to something that Dale Tuggy said about the God-man concept, right, not existing in the time frame of the apostles, and then he submits as evidence that this is not true Ignatius of Antioch from 108.
From 108.
Right. So your evidence of like the opinion of fellows who were in, let's be generous and say 45 AD, right, is the opinion of somebody who is not Jewish from 108 AD. So basically what Dale Tuggy said is correct. We cannot trace this concept of a God-man back to the period of the apostles.
And we can't. He brought up the 108 AD from Ignatius, the God-man thing. And yeah, I wrote it down. That was one of my first notes. I was like, that's not proof of anything. First of all of the disciples, every single one of them were dead before 65. Some of them have died in the rebellion that began in 65, and the temple was destroyed in 70. Many, if not any, of the disciples lived to even see that day. So all of the disciples are gone. Everything we have from that point forward would be passed down from somebody who knew them. So, and it doesn't take any more than 10, 15, not even that many years before you have a completely different religion, which is exactly what happens. Yeah, the original Christianity, if you will, is essentially gone with the destruction of the temple. The disciples spent their every waking moment at the temple studying and becoming as educated as the Pharisees so that they could lead better the new movement of Hasidim that they were essentially creating. At the destruction of the temple, a lot of that falls away. Orthodox Judaism is the only real religion that is able to maintain its integrity after the destruction. And it's because they banded together and on purpose started a council at Yavna where the Sanhedrin had moved and began to record their history in the form of the Mishnah, which is the early startings of the Talmudic period. So the best we could possibly know about early Christian Judaism in the day of the disciples is going to come from the Orthodox Jews, not from a Greek philosopher wearing a toga in Rome who heard about the religion 5 years ago, decided to read a couple of the gospels that were floating around, and has decided he is the expert now and he's going to lead the way. And many of them had never met the disciples. They had only ever met some people who possibly knew them. Some of the allegations of one of them having been disciples of the disciples are speculation at best. These are the same people who also said, and they swore up and down, that Hebrews was written by Paul. We know that's verifiably false now, but they also, the same people claim that I was a disciple of John. The information is not super credible at this point. So
it's kind of a period of, and it's funny because this has been trending on social media lately. It is very, very likely and possible that these individuals were taking advantage of a similar situation to Radio Shack, Toys R Us, and Circuit City, right? Where, since there is no HR department for anybody to call and reference and determine that you were not part of upper management, you can make the claim and nobody can really say that that's not true.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So go everyone.
I was a disciple of John. Well,
I mean, that guy
can say that that's not true. So we'll just call it good.
That. I was a floor manager in Circuit City. Cool. You're hired. Can't verify it.
Right.
Yeah, and that was very much the case. And the disciple, or the John who wrote Revelation, by the way, is likely not the disciple John. At least not in my opinion. John is such a common name back then, and still even, and to that point, Jesus is an incredibly common name. It's the third most common name in the Middle East at that time.
Right.
So yeah, it's very easy to get those things confused. But
my second point on that whole the statement that he pulls from Ignatius, right, says something about God in man. It doesn't say God man, right? It says God in man. That's a far cry from God man. That's a far cry from God as man.
Yeah, it's dangerous territory. It's the kind of language that they were willing to use because, again, God back then especially is very generic, and it's not always the deity sort of usage and term. And Dr. Tuggy, he's actually talked about this a little bit, about how you can still call somebody God and them not be being called God explicitly in the same sense, due to the lack of specificity that's found in the Greek word kurios, which is a super vague word. Again, I mean, to a certain point, Elohim is in the same manner equally vague. It's used of the word for judges, or any ruler, any person of authority, head of authority, persons, plural. It doesn't matter depending on the context. Yeah, it's an equally vague term, but yeah. And then on that, these accusations that he spends his 10 minutes in his rebuttal on are kind of in bad faith. For one, he spent his entire rebuttal not addressing a single point.
Right. He
Tuggy's opening.
Didn't use his rebuttal as a rebuttal.
Yeah. Dr. Tuggy brought up 9 very clear points, very clear observations. That was your chance to write down each observation, as I did, and then go down through each observation in your rebuttal. And you could do that right now. Observation 1, Jesus has a God who is over him and is greater than him and submits to his authority. Dr. James White could have spent some time on observation number 1 as part of his rebuttal, but he didn't. He spent his entire rebuttal making bad faith accusations about basically lying about Tuggy's position. I noticed he was saying things Tuggy never brought up and never said. And it's, it was just kind of, he was heated and he wasn't acting logically.
He after giving numerous citations from well after the apostolic period. He then makes the claim, that I did exegete the passage, right? And well, no, really, he didn't. Like he didn't give a single exegetical point. He cited figures from church history. That's not exegesis.
And again, honestly, here's what Dr. White didn't mean to do this, but he did this. Dr. Tuggy laid out his opening statement. It was very clear. A 5-year-old couldn't understand it. That's what I loved about his opening statement was that's the true form of genius, right? Take a complicated issue, simplify it. A 5-year-old could understand his opening statement. The observations, the 9 points are super clear and easy. And then from my point of view, James White gets up there and he spent the entire time having deflected rather than addressing a single point.
Yes. Very much deflecting.
So it didn't look like, to the common person, I don't think it looks like he was deflecting, because he did really well, because he was being accusative to Dr. Tuggy and lying about his position, but he was deflecting. Make no mistake about it.
He did go to, again, another one of his usual, this is very, very typical. Like, having watched enough of James White, I've realized that he actually doesn't have that many arguments for the Trinity, right?
Yeah.
He's got a very small handful, and he relies very heavily on those. None of them are really very difficult to anybody who takes the time to actually look up the passages that he's talking about. Because one of the most popular ones, you watch any James White talk about the Trinity, debate on the Trinity, like, it doesn't matter. One of the ones that you will practically 100% of the time see him reference is kind of a weird bait and switch game that he plays with Revelation 5 and Isaiah 6, right? Where he talks about the vision that Isaiah has, and this Revelation 5, because they both figure, they both have these figures sitting on the throne. Now, if you read both of these independently, it's very easy to understand that in both, it is God seated on the throne, right? Because in Revelation, what we see is that the Son is seated at the right hand of the person who is on the throne. Obvious enough. But then he makes the statement that Isaiah sees that Lamb seated on the throne, right? That he is seeing Jesus as the one who is seated on the throne. And I'm like, well, no, if you go to Isaiah and you read it through, that is nowhere to be found in what Isaiah sees, right? But like on the spot, he knows you're not going to take the time to look up those passages. Right. The point that he is trying to make with this bait and switch that he's doing between Revelation and Isaiah is very easily negated by 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah.
1 Corinthians 15 addresses in like very directly the point that James White is trying to make with the Isaiah Revelation bait and switch.
Right. It's almost like that passage was prepared for this moment, even.
Right.
But and to your point, though, I actually wrote that down. I'm glad you brought it up, because that means we're on the same wavelength. And I made a caveat to this, exactly what you said. But I said, but even if it were true, that's what Isaiah saw, which it's not. But if it were, let's say that it was. That doesn't mean anything, honestly, because really the only thing that's happening is he's using it doesn't matter who he saw where on the throne. Dr. White's position is the phrase that Isaiah uses of God is the same phrase that John uses in Revelation of Jesus. Okay. Again, that means basically nothing. The book of Kings calls the king of Babylon the King of Kings. That's a phrase only used of God, I guess, except unless you're the king of Babylon. So, just because a phrase is used of God and then is also elsewhere used of a human being doesn't mean that human being is also God. Unless you're willing to concede that the phrase King of Kings, which could be used for Jesus as well, I don't believe that it is, but it could be, then the king of Babylon is also God, and he's part of a new quaternity now.
Right. And I'll say again, he's very bold to have read out Revelation 5 the way that he did, and he read it out openly. And this is an area where, again, he was directly intellectually dishonest in how he addressed it, right? When he made mention of the fact that some of these verses, they distinguish Jesus from the Father. And he says, well, that's the point of the Trinity. That the problem is that these verses don't distinguish Jesus from the Father. They distinguish Jesus from God.
Yeah.
That's the way that they read. Verse 9 in particular, right? Verses 9 and 10, right? And they sung a new song saying, thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof. And thou wast slain and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation, and hast made us holy unto our God, kings and priests, and we shall reign on earth. It is distinguishing Jesus not from the Father. It is distinguishing Jesus from God.
Right. And then the last thing he brings up, this is the argument Muslims use. That's uncalled for, man. That's low. That's off topic, completely irrelevant. Just
poisoning the well.
Just because another religion happens to use a similar argumentative type or line of logic doesn't mean that line of logic is wrong because an atheist is using it. That's that same whole well, you're a Jew and you don't believe in Jesus, so everything you say is wrong. That's the same type of attack that he's used with these are the same arguments Muslims make. And are they wrong? That's what we need to address. So instead of just deflecting again and saying, well, that you sound like a Muslim, again, low blow, uncalled for, completely irrelevant, and very immature.
let's just even the odds here. Let's even the table. Okay. The arguments that James White is making, these are the same arguments that Gnostics make. Okay. Yeah. These are the same arguments that Neoplatonists make.
These are the same arguments that pagans have been using for years.
Okay.
See how irrelevant it is? Yeah. So, well, let's bring Mr. Tuggy on to give his 10 minutes rebuttal. And I've not seen this debate again, but I have full faith that Dr. Tuggy will be a lot more composed in actually addressing the opening statements now that he gets a chance to address the opening statement. Time for Another thing I'd want to point out is Dr. White was very emotional.
All right. I built my case on many clear texts. In contrast, my opponent has built his case mostly on 3 controversial texts, all of which are on topics other than Jesus's metaphysical status. And he ignores the evidence that Jesus had limits which a fully divine person can't have. Now, the context of this passage in 1 Peter 3 is a practical exhortation about doing what's right despite suffering, not a likely place to find a teaching that Jesus is fully divine. This passage does not apply the Hebrew name Yahweh to Jesus. Rather, it tells us to set Jesus apart as Lord, Kurios. Now, what reason does Dr. White give us to think that the word Kurios here is a substitute for the divine name? He notes that Peter uses a few of the same Greek words that are in an ancient translation of Isaiah 8, where the subject is Yahweh. But that argument is invalid. It gives us no reason to think Peter is implying that Jesus is Yahweh himself. If you're impressed by Dr. White's argument, here is a parallel argument for you to consider. Notice how 1 Peter 2:9 uses 6 of the same Greek words and in the same order as Exodus 19:6. Is Peter telling us that the Christians of his day are the same people as the Israelites during the Exodus? Of course not. Peter is just recycling famous and beloved words to describe a similar phenomenon. Christians are God's chosen people, not unlike the Jews of the time of the Exodus. Back to 1 Peter 3, we Christians honor God and God's Messiah. These are similar topics. So finding similar words in an older text about Yahweh does nothing to establish that Peter is assuming or asserting that Jesus is Yahweh or is fully divine.
Correct.
About the title Lord, James Dunn observes that even as Lord, Jesus acknowledges God not only as his Father, but also as his God. The Kyrios title is not so much a way of identifying Jesus with God as a way of distinguishing Jesus from God. The simple reading comprehension tells us that this author assumes that Jesus is less than fully divine, since he teaches Jesus to have a God, to have died, and also his mediation between the one true God and us. Now, this actual subject of John 12, in that portion of it, is the unbelief of Jesus's contemporaries, not Jesus's deity. What about the Greek words this passage has in common with an ancient translation of Isaiah 6? Well, here's one topic, God's glory. Here's another similar topic, the glory of God's Christ. It's no surprise at all that John should use words to describe Jesus' glory, which are similar to the words Isaiah used about God's glory. In this gospel, Jesus' glory is exhibited in his earthly ministry, culminating paradoxically in his crucifixion. Just before in chapter 12, Jesus has mentioned his being glorified by means of his death. Some Trinitarian commenters don't jump to the conclusion that John is implying that Jesus is the enthroned figure seen by Isaiah. In her recent commentary, Dr. Mary Ann May Thompson doesn't even mention that overreading. Why? It's just not what John's doing here. Dr. Kostenberger agrees. And many commenters point out that in early Christianity, and you see this in all the Gospels and in Acts, Isaiah 6, 9, and 10 were commonly used proof texts to explain the unbelief of many of the Jews of that time. That's why John can deploy that proof text here without worrying that his reader is going to mentally wander off into the throne room vision of Isaiah 6. In his opening, Dr. White asserts that the rest of this gospel identifies Jesus as God. For lack of time, I'll just point out that John repeatedly contrasts Jesus with God. Here are some of the many contrasts. Obviously, we don't have time tonight to explore them. For now, I'll just warn you that you will misunderstand what this amazing book teaches about Jesus and his God unless you read it as a whole. Now, about the I am statements, which Dr. White seems to read as Jesus saying, I am God himself, he ignores John's explanation of that phrase in chapter 4, when the woman at the well brings up the Messiah, and Jesus says to her, I am, ego eimi. And John's explicit thesis statement tells us that this, the Messiah, is precisely who we must believe Jesus to be. In White's view, the deity of Christ was revealed before any New Testament book was written, and so it is everywhere presupposed there. If that were true, then the author of Hebrews would be laboring throughout chapter 1 to show that a fully divine person, or Yahweh in the flesh, has recently become superior to angels, which is an absurd thing to mount an argument for. Dr. White has chosen to base his case in part on one of the most difficult texts in the New Testament, Hebrews 1, 10 through 12. Interpreters have come up with as many as 7 ways of understanding what the author is doing here. Most, like Dr. White, suppose that in verse 10, when the author simply writes and, he wants us to mentally repeat his formula from verse 8 of the Son he says. That makes the Son the subject of verses 10 through 12. But as Dr. Thomas Gaston has pointed out in a recent article, a couple of times later in the book, this author tacks on an extra quote or two using a simple connective phrase, but the leading formula should not be understood as thereby repeated. So in chapter 2, he introduces his first quote by saying, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers, but it's a mistake to repeat that introductory formula for the second and third quotations. Similarly, in 10:30, the author introduces a quote with the preface, for we know the one who said, but we're not to for we know the one who said, that's the intro, but we're not to insert that intro before the second quotation, which is in the voice of Moses, not Yahweh. The writer stays on a theme as he deploys his several quotations, but in a way where we shouldn't think the introductory phrase is being abbreviated by the connecting words. in these two cases, and again, is what he says, Kai Pauline. Now go back to 1:10 through 12. Too many readers, I suggest, mentally insert the introductory phrase again after the author's simple "and." I would suggest that's a mistake. He's just mentioned the Son's God, and so now with God in mind, he's going to continue on his theme of the forwards eternity of the Son's reign. The basis of this unending reign, he is saying, is the unending God who established it. So the Lord of verse 10 is God, not Jesus, just like in Psalm 102. Interestingly, in the whole 9-volume Ante-Nicene Fathers set, there are 0 references to Hebrews 1, 10, 11, or 12. Why is that? Well, my interpretation explains why. It would be that early readers took these verses to be about God, not Jesus, and all early Christians agreed that the Creator is the Father, like all the early creeds say. So much for Dr. White's claim that these are an obvious deity of Christ proof text. For this author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, Jesus is a man who obeyed God even through a terrible death. Flesh and blood persons like you and I are his siblings, and he has been made a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, unlike God. This man has been elevated to the right hand of the Majesty on high. These teachings rule out Jesus being fully divine. Now, the context of the famous Philippians 2 passage is a practical exhortation, and the stated subject of that passage is Christ Jesus, which refers to a man who obeys God even through a terrible death, which tells us that he's not essentially immortal and so is not fully divine. This is why this text can give no support at all to deity of Christ speculations. The sort of scenario incarnation theorists imagine here would not be a relevant example for people like us who never face a choice to lay aside divine glory to become human. We should think that Paul is using an example which is relevant to us, and so we find some highly qualified interpreters exegeting it to be about Jesus during his earthly ministry, not before, including Dr. Andrew Perriman of the London School of Theology in this insightful recent monograph, In the Form of God, of a God. In sum, the full deity of Christ is never the clear subject of any New Testament passage. Thus, Trinitarian interpreters must labor to deduce it from a few unclear texts. Meanwhile, the many clear texts depict a human Jesus, and it's revealing that the New Testament authors feel no need for any two natures doctrine. Thank you.
As I suspected, excellently done.
Yeah. I noticed that a few times in that rebuttal, he uttered the words, Dr. White in his opening.
Yeah, I was just going to say, my first note is actually rebutting Dr. White's points.
Right.
Like, no, and that, I'm not just making it up. In my notes, I have the old, he uses Isaiah 53, and I've already talked about in part 1, he used it wrong. My next note says the old Hebrews 1 shtick. I wrote that in my notes, like, because that's, and then John 12:41. And then I said, really? Philippians ? I have an article on this one. And then 1 Peter 3:14. Those are all in Mr. Dr. White's opening statement. And those are all points. That's not every single point that Dr. White made. He only had 10 minutes, but that's the majority of the points that Dr. White was making. And he actually went back and addressed those points, something that Dr. White did not do.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing that he brought up, and this is kind of how Dr. White began also, essentially trying to belittle the point that Dale Tuggy is bringing out. That Dale Tuggy is like, look, I'm addressing quite a number of passages that are very plain and direct in what they say and mean.
Yep.
And he is focusing on primarily 3 highly disputed verses. Okay.
Yeah.
James White essentially made the argument that is a cop-out, right? That he He just says, well, they're disputed, and then he decides not to deal with them. And that can seem like that's a reasonable response, because I mean, Dale Tuggy doesn't spend a whole lot of time addressing those, but there's a reason for that. The reason is the difference between what the verses say, right, versus what the verses mean. Dale Tuggy decided to focus on a long list of verses that what they say is not disputed. Right. That's even Trinitarians agree that that's what those verses mean. Right. That is what they say. That is what they mean. The reason Trinitarians typically do not try and wrestle with those verses is because the best thing they can come up with is, well, yeah, that's what it means, but it's not in the context of what you're saying. Right. It's still in the context of Jesus being God. But this is just referring to his human form, right? It's his human nature. It's they make a distinction that the author is not making, or rather they I would say even they highlight the distinction that the author is trying to amplify and then immediately undercut it. The reason Tuggy is not addressing these highly disputed verses is because that simplicity doesn't exist for these three verses. Right, these three passages. It is not as simple as everybody agrees that's what it says and that's what it means, but how we take that is where it's different. The disputation is what these verses say and mean at all.
Right, and in fact, a pretty good example of this is the Philippians 2 article that I wrote. I put the link in the chat if you guys want to check it out. It's free now. And one of the things I go over is exactly that. Is like there's a parts in this entire what would you call it? It's really poetic, so I guess a poem in this creed. It's a pre-literary tradition, but the Greek could not be any more vague with a particular word that is commonly translated as robbed or robbery. So sometimes you see different translations render it as did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, or something, or to robbed or robbery to consider equality with God. Like it's always a very clunky translation because that Greek word, it's not very simple. And I go over in the article but in extra biblical literature, every time we see this word being used, it is always talking about seizing or taking something that a person did not previously have. And it's something that he could not obtain. So it's like, but I have to spend probably a 10-minute article explaining the concept of this particular word in the subject line before I can even offer an alternative translation, which my alternative translation that I offer is did not consider equality with God something that he could obtain. Which again, anyone with whether it's right or wrong, most Christians they have this belief that the fall of Satan is a issue of pride because he thought he could obtain God's stature, right, and take the throne from God. And so if anything, this should be a parallel to that for most mainstream Christians that believe this particular belief, that's the parallel here, is that Jesus did not consider equality with God something that he could obtain like Satan did, right? Like, so that's more what's meant to be going on there. And that took 10 minutes just now, like you don't have time to sit there and do that with these really complicated passages. And the last thing I also wrote for Dr. Tuggy's rebuttal is my dude brought receipts, which is surprising for a rebuttal. He had 10 minutes to prepare that in the background while Dr. White was speaking. And passages and examples of different phraseologies using elsewhere, but not meaning anywhere near the same thing with the same kind of gravity. The man brought receipts, and that was impressive. I feel like he knew those were going to happen, and he just had that, already loaded in the chamber, because I don't think you could prepare that quick enough.
Again, James White doesn't have a wide diversity of argumentation on the Trinity. He has 2 or 3 scripts that he can recite. And if if I were Dale Tuggy, I would have just scoured YouTube for all of the debates that I've seen James White do. And yeah, I probably could have put together a rebuttal also, already knowing what James White was going to say.
We kind of did this with our own debate. We did our best to predict what our opponents
There
were
are
going.
only so many anti-Torah arguments from
Right.
Paul, and there's a particular mode of argumentation that the anti-Torah side of the aisle follows.
Right.
And
yeah.
in our opening statement, the number of people who have reached out to me to praise us on that opening statement, and I've had even some people ask like if I could send it to them so that they could use it to prepare for their own debate, like and take notes off of it and stuff. Yeah, I mean, essentially, like we cut every possible line of argumentation off immediately at the feed in the opening statement. There's really not far to go after that.
Yeah, and then they insisted that we stay in Acts 15 as a result.
Oh yeah,
of that, which it shows, and they were not ready for that Acts 15, which shows that they had previously prepared something else, but in our opening statement we had already ruined it for them. So they hyper focused on something else that they thought that maybe we weren't ready for. And to be honest, we didn't really necessarily prepare to spend any time in Acts 15 because we were focused on, Pauline anti-Torah arguments, which
Right.
is usually how people go about this. But once we had already shut that down as an avenue of approach for them, they tried to focus away from anything that Paul had to say about Torah, knowing that we were ready for that. So they went to Acts. We were fine with Acts. That that's one of our favorite passages anyway, when talking about this stuff. But yeah, Dr. Tuggy, he's probably done exactly that. He's predicted the arguments here and is already locked and loaded and ready to go with a few, like he's basically got like a cylinder, like for a revolver. He's got like a cylinder of key arguments that he's got fully prepared and he's ready to hone in on. And then if there's anything on the outside of that, he can address them onesie twosies here and there with minimal preparation because all the big stuff is handled already. So he doesn't have to think about those arguments. He can read from a paper or a note card, which it seems like that's what Dr. Tuggy did. He addressed like 5 key points from Dr. White. And I think that's because he had those key points all ready to go.
Right. It's there are some subjects that just, there's not that much diversity in like pathways and avenues of what you can argue, like the whole Talmud is evil. I could write up an opening statement and then write up a rebuttal, and it doesn't really matter who I'm going up against because there's really only one avenue of argumentation that the opposition can take, right? So I know within 4 or 5 different tractates what I'm going to have thrown at me because there really only are 4 or 5 small portions that are cherry-picked for that purpose.
Yeah, if you Google it, they're all the same every time, and it's all the same false information. So it's pretty easy to combat. Yeah, and I'm at the point now where I get emails all the time on people commenting on some of our videos about the Talmud, and it's all the same. I've stopped addressing it. I'm like, I'm sort of tired saying the same thing over and over again to people that aren't.
You get that one person who brings up one and it's like, oh my gosh, like 5 comments above this, like we addressed that.
Yeah. Recently I saw one where somebody just posted, address these, and they put like, whole pages. They said, address these verses in the Talmud, and they put a whole page, right? Because they don't know how a verse in the Talmud works. So they just put like Soda 54b. And I'm like, where in Soda 54b?
Which part of that?
That means nothing to me. Do you know how big a page of Talmud is, man? That's not a verse. You want a commentary on a book? I mean, so, obviously they're trying to bait for something that they Googled and not realizing that there's whole conversations happening in there. And so that's a key to me too. Like, you have no idea what you're talking about. So
we don't know enough about this topic to have an argument.
Yeah. Like you know enough to understand that there is a Talmud, and you need to be taught how it works before we can proceed with your so-called issues that you might have with it, because you don't even realize that there's a part in that page that completely rebuts the part that you think you are bringing up to us, but it's actually within that same page the rebuttal to it. And so if you just kept reading, you would know this is nothing. It handles itself within itself.
Right.
Yeah, but
the Google keyboard warriors.
The Google keyboard warriors. The YouTube University system is very much pass fail. Sometimes it's great, like for mechanics, and other times it's fail for like
no. We'll call it keyboard warriors from the Google Guild.
From the Google Guild, I like that. Well, we're at the hour mark, and we've finished the rebuttals. So I think part 3 will be the cross-examination then. Yep.
Cross-examine is that's another fun part. Again, that's you've noticed already. James White is kind of beginning to get a little emotional.
He's very preachy.
Yes,
he does not. Now, don't take this the wrong way. I mean, everyone's different, but I feel like I'm a very old soul, and I study a lot of old documents and old history. And then as a hobby, I tend to focus on like the turn of the 20th century history. And I'm so used to scholars and PhDs, doctors, the elite, having a sense of gentlemanly composure and tact, right? And bearing for everything that they do. Like very, like I think of scholars in my studies, I know this isn't true today, but I'm just used to thinking, oh, he has a doctorate. So he has a very J.R.R. Tolkien like aura about him. Like I just imagine that he's a very straight back, chin up, matter of fact, no emotion. And so Dr. Tuggy seems to be doing a good job of maintaining that sense of bearing intact among scholars. James White sounds like a pastor of a megachurch, and it's very unbecoming of a scholar. I don't see him as being very scholarly. He lacks the tact and bearing for it, I think.
Yeah. And I think he's grown more that way in his old age. You watch some of his arguments when he's younger. He is a little better about being this way, that you've described. He's better about having that sense of decorum. Perhaps still not quite as well as I would say Dr. Tuggy has, exhibited. Yeah. There is a certain point and a certain air of even in his older debates, right? There's a certain air of like the condescension of, are you really challenging me on this? Right? I have to have this argument, right? It's the condescending assumption of like, I'm already right, so I shouldn't have to defend my position.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that attitude's not really working in your favor.
No, it's not. And I can understand having an attitude like that if you can back it up with receipts, like Dr. Tuggy does. But again, a good scholar would not. I mean, we do see it a lot where they have this cockiness about them, fine enough, depending on who you're talking to. If you're talking to the unwashed masses, I can see where it just gets tiring after a while and you start to lose your bearing over it. But from scholar to scholar, Dr. Tuggy is a peer, my friend. You don't talk to him like you're a pastor in a megachurch. You will speak to him like he's speaking to you. Matter of fact, no emotion, bearing. It's just, hey man, these are the facts. I'm trying to do my best here to be as simple and plain and as understandable as possible for the audience, who are also at the university level. I believe this is at a university. I think the venue, whatever. The point is, he's maintaining a sense of decorum that James White has forgotten about, and he looks the part. He's got the nice beard, dresses nicely. I'm not gonna lie. If I would be lying if I didn't say that I wasn't jealous of his dress and attire and the beard and everything. Like, if I ever look that good at his age, man, that'd be a miracle in and of itself. But alas, I can't even grow a beard. So.
Oh goodness.
But yeah. So on that merit alone, again, that doesn't determine who wins, but it does say a lot about the person. And I feel that Dr. Tuggy is handling himself in a more mature manner, which is not indicative of winning, but it is it's signaling his victory.
Composure in a debate is it's not necessarily an indicator of who is winning, like you said, but it is an indicator of who is the most comfortable and confident, like truly confident, not posturing confident. Posturing confident is actually to make up for a lack of confidence.
Yeah, and usually most people can kind of see through that because it's, you're being loud on purpose, and it's, not everyone's going to spot it, but most, especially people who understand the topic, are going to spot that. They're going to be like, I've noticed he's talking loudly, but he's not saying much.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, again, James White missed a big opportunity here. If Dr. White had spent more time actually rebutting his opening statement, then this would have gone a lot more smoother for him. But he spent his entire rebuttal rebutting the fact that he didn't rebut his opening statement, which again makes no sense. And so he wasted his entire 10-minute rebuttal time just making these really low digs at Dr. Tuggy. And a great on Dr. Tuggy too for not even mentioning anything about James White's rebuttal at all. He didn't say anything about like the bringing up the Muslim low shot. He didn't even bring up the fact that like he's a bigger man than me, because I would have been like, well, Dr. White, rebuttals are the time to address opening statements. My opening statement was not the time to rebut your opening statement. I would have said that. But Dr. Tuggy did not. He stayed on course. He stayed in his lane, and he guided that plane into a perfect landing.
Right. Yeah. Well, he's letting his argument speak for itself rather than trying to break his opponent down external the argument.
Right. Which is
right. with other factors that don't pertain to the subject.
Yeah. So good. I like Dr. Tuggy a lot. I've only seen him debate. This is the second time, and I've been nothing but impressed with everything I've seen from him thus far. So
the next one we got to do after this one, not right after, right, but but in the future is his debate with Michael Brown. I haven't even watched that one yet.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because Michael, that one I'll definitely have to have maybe something a little stronger, because Michael Brown is insufferable to me.
Yeah, I was gonna say I have a bone to pick with Michael Brown particularly, so you and I will both have to suffer together on that one.
Yeah.
It looks like we'll just, we'll just buy and drink straight vodka for that one. From like Iceland.
Right. Only from potatoes.
Yeah, it's got to be a potato vodka from Iceland, filtered through volcanic ash. It's gonna be a high. It's not gonna be like Grey Goose. We're high class vodka here, right. But straight vodka, because we need something to help us get through that.
Yep. That being said, we have a book out. It's cool. Buy our book. The link is below. It's got a lot of articles, like the Philippians 2 article that Seamus wrote, which is, by the way, an excellent breakdown of the passage and the context in which it should be understood. Absolutely spectacular. He talked about it a little bit tonight, kind of undersold it in my opinion. It's great. So that's in the book. There's a number of other articles that are kind of surrounding the Trinity topic that are also in the book. That'll be in there. And just all around Torah knowledge, historical knowledge. Yeah, we go over a little bit of history.
It's a little bit of everything. It's every article we've ever written, combined into a single volume. And and next year we'll have, this year I guess, but the end of this year we'll have volume 2, which will include all the articles and
it'll probably be a little bit smaller.
Yeah, the first one we did include articles even from a couple of years before that too. So
right.
The first volume was bigger because it wasn't just that year's articles.
Multiple years piled into one book because it's the first time that we did the book.
Yeah, but it is actually, there's a lot of good information in that book. There's some articles in there that I hadn't fully read through, even from James and yourself, rereading it. And it's like, man, we did a good thing here. These are good stuff. I forgot I used to be this good at writing.
Yep. And we're working on other avenues of content also. some of the articles that are in the book, we are beginning to turn into lecture content. So hopefully one day we'll be able to actually go out and, give presentations in front of congregations about some of this material with very professional slideshows. And that's some of what we're working on now. So look forward to that. It'll be a cool experience to be able to, actually present in front of people. And obviously working on more video content, always accepting recommendations for especially reviews like we've done today. I love debate reviews, but also just if there's like just a general video in general. I've done general video reviews. Seamus has done general video reviews. Send us something you want to rebuttal to. We'll roll it around and see what we can do about it.
Or ask a question. Sometimes questions lead to the writing of many articles.
That is also true.
Yeah, it's one of those. There are often times where we get asked a question and it's like, oh yeah, I almost forgot. We had never addressed this topic yet. Thank you for asking. Now we will produce, some kind of media to actually cover that. When, at our stage, we've been doing this for so long, we tend to forget what people think about every little thing. We sometimes we have to be reminded what it is, that what we thought was obvious is not so super obvious to those who haven't been walking this walk for more than 15 years like we have. And so, the Hebrews, I did the Hebrews 9 article.
Another spectacular one.
That was one where I thought it was so done. When the question was asked, I ended up just writing an article, remembering that this is not common knowledge, and it was common knowledge for me. But so yeah, please ask us questions, drop them in the chat, the comments, go on our Discord and drop questions there. They always lead to answers and articles, and we try to help you guys out with understanding. And even if we can't, which is very rare, but even if we can't, we have books that we can recommend that you buy and read. And we every year do a book giveaway where we take a conglomeration of all these books that we've recommended over the years and give them out for free. Usually we do about 10 books we give away every year.
Yep.
So yeah, consider becoming a subscriber, support the cause. We are a 501c3. Your donations are tax deductible. And thank you all for your support. You make this happen. All of our supporters who have been supporting us since the very beginning. I mean, it's a miracle. You guys rock. So our website looks like it does because of you. The 501 exists because of you guys. Really, we can't thank you guys enough.
Absolutely. And that being said, some of you have access to the after parties on the Discord. That is a place where we go after the show to have a more candid, personal conversation with those who are donating members. To be a donating member, you can go to the website or the Patreon, either one. Membership starts at $1 a month. So we've tried to make it as affordable as possible for you to have access to these privileges. And it's a place for you to ask us questions about what we talked about tonight, ask us questions about something else entirely. Just sit and chill and have some fellowship, which is what we're about to go do now. So if you want access to that, membership starts at $1. Would highly recommend. And it also puts your name in the drawing for the Purim giveaway, the bookshelf event where we give away the 10 books that my colleague has mentioned. So we need to go get over to that. That all being said, we hope to see you all back next time where we go over the cross-examinations. Definitely like and subscribe if you liked what you saw tonight. Ring the bell when you want to be alerted that there is other content being uploaded. And we definitely hope to see you all again. L'chaim.